Hello, welcome to a special in-depth segment on the G7 summit in Hiroshima, Japan. It is already the third day of the G7 summit, and President Yoon Suk-yeol has been participating in expanded sessions and engaging in bilateral talks with other world leaders. Today, in a symbolic move, he paid his respects to the Korean victims of the 1945 Hiroshima atomic bombing alongside Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, and held yet another summit with the Japanese leader after that. And just now, trilateral talks between Seoul, Tokyo, and Washington have just taken place, along with bilateral talks, that is, with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. And for an in-depth look at President Yoon's diplomatic moves, we have invited Professor Han Shuttle from Yonsei University. Professor, welcome.
Nice to see you, Bo-kyung.
And we also have Professor Song Se-ryun from Kyung University. Professor Song, good to see you.
Good to see you.
All right, let me ask you first, Professor Song. The three leaders held a trilateral meetup this afternoon, which is the first time since they have gathered in Cambodia last November. And it was rather a casual meetup than a former summit, and there were no joint announcements made. But President Biden invited Yoon and Kishida to Washington for a former trilateral summit. What significance does this short meetup have?
Well, the important question is, did they smile? I think that more seriously, because this is a follow-up meeting, I think is significant in that they are still maintaining a good relationship, and the things they talked about in Phnom Penh probably will add some details, not on the president's side, but in the working level. So I think it's a continuation. And I think more significance is whether there's any significant change from the last meeting, or whether it is progressing in a more detailed side. So I wouldn't be worried about it. And however short it is, if I see the three presidents smiling, probably it's a good sign.
Right, I see. Now, Professor Shutter, may I ask your opinion on this?
Sure, I agree very much with Professor Song here. I think it's a confirmation that the diplomacy is on course. And remember that the U.S. is never happy when South Korea and Japan are not getting along. So I think it's been a priority for President Biden to try to help Japan and South Korea strengthen the relationship and kind of turn a corner in the relationship. So it seems the three of them met and they confirmed that the corner has been turned and they're going on their way. But I'd also emphasize that President Biden met individually with President Yoon. President Biden met with Prime Minister Kishida, and Yoon and Kishida also met. So there was a lot of conversation with the leaders in pairs as well as in this larger group, and that kind of coordination will count for something, I think.
Right. Now, Professor Song, the trilateral meeting focused on reaffirming the promises that were made during the last summit, such as enhancing sharing the real-time information to effectively tackle with North Korea's persistent missile threats. First of all, how is this real-time information sharing different from, GSOMIA and TISA that we know of?
Well, among TISA and GSOMIA, TISA is trilateral information sharing. So from Japan's point of view, it's the worst of the arrangement because they have to hear it from the U.S. if we share information with the U.S. GSOMIA is better because it covers more comprehensive and also it covers conversation directly between the parties. I think more important arrangement or the upgrade from that arrangement is that this time it's a real time. So it's a matter of whether we're reading yesterday's paper or today's paper, but what's better is reading it real time on Twitter or other news outlets. So in that level, I think that the quality of the information is enhanced when it's accurate, and also timeliness is very, very important. So in terms of sharing it in real time is a real upgrade from the previous arrangements.
Right, so what matters is that it is real time.
Right.
Right. Now, Professor Shuttle, now that we know the difference between all those three, how are working level discussions over enhancing this real-time information sharing going on? And what are the difficulties if there's is any, in making such a three-way system operate well?
Right. I would find it very interesting, actually, to be sitting in the room and trying to listen to these conversations because we don't necessarily know the details of it. I assume the defense ministries have to work out some coordination, and also that the various military operations have to work out coordination as well. One thing we've seen in the news coverage about this over the past few days are some comments from military analysts here in South Korea that have suggested in the past, when there's been sharing of information between Korea and Japan, that the information has not always been accurate. And I don't know which direction it's not been accurate. Maybe there have been little inaccuracies in both directions. But hypothetically, and in these days, of course, it actually happens from time to time, if North Korea launches a missile, even if it's just a test, even if it's pretty obvious that the missile's not going to be striking land anywhere in the region, the two countries, I think, in that kind of a situation, they're going to want to be able to share information on the spot. Where was the launch point of the missile? What exact direction does the missile seem to be going? Can they project where the missile's going to land? And the governments, I think all three governments really want to make sure that they have systems and technology and operational control in place to be able to kind of manage those kinds of elevated alert situations. And I'm sure those are the sorts of details that they'll be working out in these conversations with their bureaucrats behind the scenes.
Right, I see the point. Now, Professor Song, much attention actually has been given to whether Japan will be included in the South Korea-U.S. nuclear consultative group, as President Yoon did not rule out the possibility of Japan's inclusion during the press briefing with Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. Now, though the issue was not included in the discussion, is there any possibility that the talks of this NCG would further develop in a way to include Japan?
Well, possibility is there. U.S. did not rule out the possibility either. So if Japan wants it, probably serious discussion could continue. But I think the arrangement is more important to Korea because of our imminent threat from the North Korea. From Japan's point of view, they might be ambivalent even because they are already covered by the nuclear umbrella given by the U.S. And they had been adamant about their stance of no nukes in their country, no development, no possession, and no use. So from that standpoint, participating in this kind of discussion in and of itself might be a little bit tricky or sensitive for them. So in that sense, they don't gain a whole lot by joining in, but from a larger point of view, because we're strengthening the regional security arrangement amongst the U.S. and Korea and Japan. So some would say, why not? But in terms of a practical use of it, probably Japan has a choice of just staying out or be an active part of it.
Right. So though there is possibility that we'll have to wait and see.
Right.
Right. Professor Shuttle, moving on to the economic security area, strengthening the resilience of supply chain and enhancing economic security cooperation between three countries is, of course, as important as the boosting security part as well. Now, what discussions have been made up until now?
Right, and this gets us closer to the heart of the G7 talks this weekend as well, Bo-kyung. Really interesting topic. So first of all, South Korea and Japan have been working already, kind of laying the groundwork over the past several weeks to restore the more preferential trade relationships between the two countries to get goods and products moving back and forth again. But what's also interesting this weekend is the G7 did make some statements with regard to China, because in a sense the countries that were not at the summit, Russia and China, were the countries that in many ways were on everybody's mind as we were kind of following these talks. And of course security issues, we'll come to that in a moment with Russia's war on Ukraine. But the economic side, here China got a lot of attention, and the G7 leaders did issue some statements suggesting that they are concerned about the possibility of China being overly coercive with its provisions of materials. There's a lot of minerals and other commodities that China, digs up out of the ground in many cases that go into the manufacturing of high-tech products, whether it's semiconductors or these days solar panels, electric car batteries. And the leaders of the Western democracies, with all the disruption that we've seen to global supply chains over the couple of years, are concerned that China's continuing to restrict access in some respects. And they're calling upon China to be more open about providing these kinds of commodities into the marketplace in the first place. And there were also some statements about the G7 leaders trying to build more networks economically with developing countries, in the so-called global south, in the southern hemisphere, which actually gets into why you had leaders from places like Indonesia and India and Brazil at this summit this time around as well. So in a sense, I think it's more, in terms of this weekend's discussion, it's more about Korea and Japan being on the same page and trying to open up access to these markets. And one thing, one word choice that was very interesting is the G7 ended up talking less about decoupling from China, which suggests more of a breakaway. And the phrase that they used instead was de-risking.
De-risking.
And I've heard that Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, had some impact in arguing for this voice, that the emphasis is not going to be so much about moving away from China as it is about trying to manage this relationship with China. And keep in mind also that in Europe, and there are several European countries at the G7 as well, Germany, France, and Italy, and even Britain, they tend to have a less adversarial relationship, I think, with China than we might think. The U.S. relationship with China, which does at times become kind of adversarial, these two major powers, or South Korea's very difficult kind of balancing relationship with China. Europe, they're a little bit more remote, and they see the relationship much more in terms of economics. So I think in some ways they were driving the bus on a lot of the positioning that came out of the G7 in China this weekend.
Right, it's really interesting to hear about the de-risking part. Right, interesting. Now, Professor Song, some experts point out that South Korea needs to strengthen its trilateral alliance with the United States and Japan in trade and investment as well to overcome global geoeconomic challenges and supply chain disruptions. In what ways could Seoul enhance this economic ties with Japan and Washington, in your opinion?
Right. This supply chain question is very interesting, and I think that the background information as to whether there is a new Cold War type of landscape developing, I think is a very good question, because based on what kind of landscape develops, Korea and the relationship with other countries can be specifically defined. I think that even without that kind of question, the neighborhood information is always important. Japan and Korea have similar economic structures, and their development path is very similar, and the corporate cultures are very similar, and the societies face the same kind of questions, like the aging populations, with the immigration questions looming in the future. So it is very strange if there is not much collaborations between us. I think that the biggest kind of a breakthrough these days is that rather than stuck on certain issues for a long time, we realize we can walk and chew at the same time. We deal with the historical issues and also economic and the security issues as well. So in terms of kind of doling out different details and putting in the workable solutions in those areas and the questions, I think it is important that we talk frequently and in sufficient details. And with that, this kind of opportunities to talk and advance those issues forward is very important. But having said that, though, going back to the big question of whether there's a Cold War developing, I don't see the clear two sides like we had decades ago. I think there are economic questions that drives the practical decisions driving especially those countries on the south, as Professor Shah mentioned, with India and Brazil, and a whole host of other countries are looking at this question of whether this is going to be good for their economic development or not. I think that the U.S. is working on kind of a bigger project to restore the liberal international order the way it was before, and they're trying to figure out what role they can play going forward. But I think that even that should be resolved in dialogues rather than just confrontations.
Right, I see. Now, Professor Shuttle, stronger bilateral ties between Seoul and Tokyo is the key to the stronger trilateral relationship. And so let's focus on South Korea and Japan here. This morning, President Yoon Suk-yeol and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida paid their respects at a monument for Korean victims of the atomic bombing. This marks the first time the two leaders from the nations jointly visited the monument. Now, what significance does this visit have in terms of improved bilateral ties, and why is it so symbolic?
Yeah, that's right, Bo-kyung. I mean, this is, of course, the first city ever to be struck by an atomic weapon. So there's been very high symbolism all weekend watching the leaders of the G7 in Hiroshima. Any visit to Hiroshima inevitably carries that kind of symbolism. It's kind of the legacy that that city now carries on its shoulders.
Right.
So yes, I mean, President Yoon and Prime Minister Kishida spent some time together. This was, in a sense, their bilateral meeting this morning. I think for one thing, it symbolizes a kind of shared loss. As we've been talking all weekend, Korea lost 30,000 people in that attack. I think 50,000 people were in Hiroshima at the time the bomb fell.
Right.
So that commemoration with the two leaders looking at it together certainly sends a very strong message. Although, on the other hand, I do wonder if people watching this here in Korea will also be left with a little bit of bitterness as well, thinking that these people that were in Hiroshima in many cases were brought to Japan or were in Japan, not so much because they wanted to be there during the colonial period, but they were there because of all other kinds of circumstances of necessity. So, you know, the coercive aspects of that previous era are not lost, I think, on many people watching. Now, the two leaders also had a talk after this, and they made some statements. President Yoon, I thought, was quite generous in his statement about Prime Minister Kishida. He said, and I think this was, at least this is the news coverage I've seen, that that his comments earlier this month, actually, in Seoul, about feeling the heartache of the forced labors in Japan, that President Yoon said that those comments resonated very deeply with the Korean people. It sounds as if that's a favorable reply to the comments from Prime Minister Kishida, almost saying to Prime Minister Kishida, things are good now, you don't have to worry anymore, you don't have to go any further, with an apology. I'm not sure that that's where the balance of South Korean public opinion is at right now. So I think this encounter will be getting a lot of scrutiny over the next several days, whether the historical memories have been dealt with well enough. After the visit to Seoul from Prime Minister Kishida, there seemed to be a lot of concern that things really hadn't been patched up yet as fully as they could have been. President Yoon now seems to be saying to Prime Minister Kishida, consider it all patched up. And I think the question here in Korea will be, well, is the glass full? Is the glass half full? Is the glass about a quarter full? And President Yoon will have to figure out how to meet the South Korean public wherever it's at, and then reflect that back on Prime Minister Kishida as all the diplomacy and all these efforts to strengthen economic and security cooperation go forward.
Right, I see your point. Professor Song, after that, President Yoon Suk-yeol had yet another meeting with Japanese Prime Minister Kishida today, which is a mere 2 weeks after their one-on-one meeting, second one-on-one that is in Seoul, and the third encounter in the span of just 2 months. Now, what were mainly discussed, and could we certainly say that bilateral relations have indeed warmed up?
Yeah, I think so, because the big thing this year in the relationship with Japan is that we restored the shuttle summit meetings. And as the time or the meeting goes on, I think that we're getting into more specifics. We're talking about the historical matters, but also we're talking about the economic exchanges and also a cultural aspect as well. So in that sense, the countries are getting a little bit more closer now. To be frank about it, I don't think the two countries will ever completely patch up in terms of, how we see the historical matters. But I think we can be more pragmatic about other matters, especially security and the economic matters. I think that will drive our economies forward, and based on that relationship, probably we can build more constructive dialogues, including the historical baggages that both countries have. So in that sense, I think that the third meeting this year, I think more should be forthcoming. And what we should look out for is whether, other than the smiling faces and the summit meetings, whether working level discussions drive forward with a lot of agreements and a lot of arrangements, and making it into an institution between two countries rather than just follow-up.
Right, I hope to see that. Now, Professor Shuttle, we cannot leave out Ukrainian President's visit to Hiroshima, can we? He landed in Hiroshima on Saturday, and a meeting between Presidents Yoon and Zelensky has taken place at Ukraine's request, interestingly. And this comes just days after President Yoon met with Zelensky's wife, Olena Zelenskaya, in Seoul. What were discussed, do you believe, and what could be suggested from Zelensky's request for a meeting with President Yoon?
Right. This was the showstopper of the weekend, I think.
Yeah.
The leader of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, arriving in, of course, after all the other leaders had shown up. In fact, the leaders of the G7 countries actually sped up the releases of their communiques, their statements, so they could then shift to the center of gravity, to the summit, over to the Ukrainian questions. So yes, President Zelensky did request this meeting with President Yoon, and I think it underscores that the country's kind of striking a difficult balance right now when it comes to the war in Ukraine. I mean, on the one hand, as a liberal democracy, and as a treaty ally of the United States, and as a country that produces a lot of lethal weapons and has a fairly strong military, it could make sense for South Korea to go further in its support of Ukraine, campaigning for its independence against Russia, with Russia trying to invade and disrupt the society, destroy, in a sense, destroy and sort of reconfigure the society entirely. So you think that in some ways, in theory, South Korea would want to be behind that. But South Korea, of course, it is behind it in one sense, providing humanitarian aid, as President Yoon, as you alluded to, promised the First Lady of Ukraine at their meeting not so long ago. So on the one hand, I'm sure President Zelensky was thankful to President Yoon for providing that humanitarian aid. I would be very surprised if the two leaders met for the time that they did, apparently about a half hour, 35 minutes or so. I'd be very surprised if they met for that long, and they did not discuss any prospect of what more South Korea could do.
Right.
And here's the tricky situation. As everybody knows, this country is in a very tough neighborhood with a very close proximity to Russia, close proximity to China. Some very harsh words came out from the Russian government after President Yoon began to suggest earlier this year that there was maybe more that South Korea could do in terms of providing support to Ukraine. I mean, it's very interesting if you watch what's happening globally, because one of the big takeaways from the G7 has been that the U.S. and European partners are now going to work more closely in providing F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. And the U.S. is going to provide training programs for the Ukrainian soldiers. Europe's going to provide the actual weapons. I mean, again, South Korea could be part of that, but I think it's not going to be part of it. Yet, Korea is also in a very different position from countries like Brazil or Indonesia or India, which were also at the summit. Those are, in a sense, the swing states. And some of the headlines we've seen this weekend are suggesting that the real reason, above all, aside from reconnecting with his supporters here, has been for Zelensky to try to connect with these leaders and try to get the swing states to go further in at least condemning the Russian invasion of Ukraine, seeing what they can do to lend support. So just as we were talking, in this half hour about the global South being more integrated in the global economy in many respects with regard to supply chains and so forth, I think the G7 countries are also looking for ways to kind of bring the global South nations on board a little bit further in this struggle for Ukrainian independence.
Right. Now, Professor Song, we heard what Professor Shuttle thinks about the Ukrainian war. What's your view on this? I mean, is there any possibility that Seoul might change its direction and accept Kyiv's request for, providing their lethal weapons?
Well, you say, you don't say never. I think a lot depends on what's happening in the war and also what's happening in Russia itself, whether Putin will continue to drive these efforts or not. But I think that for now, South Korea has a principled approach where we would provide the humanitarian support, and we focus on playing a big role after the war, whenever that comes. And also a big principle is that we are with our allies, U.S. and other countries that are looking at the situation very closely. So depends on what happens, depends what changes in the alliance and our collective kind of a humanitarian conscience. I cannot rule out the situation where it comes a point where we have to supply certain goods other than the humanitarian and non-lethal weapons, but that time has not arrived. I think that principled approach is a good one in terms of being agile about the changes that could happen in the future, but the key the mindset that we have is that it has to be helping the people and also humanitarian in nature. So no matter how difficult it is diplomatically and pragmatically, because we have had a good relationship with Russia and it's a bigger economy than the Ukraine, but all those things kind of conspire into making Korea trying to think seriously about how the middle power at this point, with a lot of contributing capabilities that we have, can move. I think it, again, depends on the dialogues that we have with our allies and also people in distress.
Right. I mean, what matters is that we are supporting Ukraine. Right. As much as I'm enjoying this talk, I'd like to ask more questions to our experts, but unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. But thank you, Professor Song.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you, Professor Shutter, for your insights. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Bo-kyung. Pleasure.
Thank you. All right, that is all for this special in-depth segment. Stay tuned for our later newscast at 6 p.m. Korea time for the latest updates from the G7 Summit in Hiroshima. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.
We are trendy. We are tradition. We are Busan. We are future. We are nature. We are Busan. We are energetic. We are eco-friendly. We are Busan. The city ready for World Expo. We are Busan. Busan is ready for World Expo.